There's a pattern some people live with for years before they notice it. It shows up quietly, in conversations that start warm but never deepen, in connections that feel promising for a week, maybe two, and then fade without explanation, in relationships that seem to end before they ever really begin. No fight, no betrayal, just distance. And after it happens enough times, a question starts to form. Not out loud, not to anyone else. Just in the mind, late at night, or during a long drive. Why does this keep happening? At first, the answer feels external. Maybe the timing was off. Maybe the other person wasn't ready. Maybe it just wasn't meant to be. But eventually, if you're honest with yourself, you start to notice something else. The interest was real. On both sides, there was potential. There was something there. But somewhere between the first spark and anything deeper, something shifted. Not in them. In you. You pulled back, not dramatically, not in a way anyone could point to. But you did. And now, looking back across months or years, you can see it. A trail of almosts. Connections that could have been something, but weren't. People who seemed to want to know you, but never got the chance. And the question changes. It's no longer, why does this keep happening? It becomes something harder to sit with. What am I doing that stops it before it starts? Once you begin to see the pattern, it's difficult to unsee. You start to notice the moment it happens, the exact point where something in you decides to step back. It's not always obvious. It doesn't announce itself, but it's there. Someone asks a question that requires a real answer, not small talk. Something that would let them see you a little more clearly, and you feel it, a tightening, a reflex to stay surface level, to keep things light, to redirect. You tell yourself it's not the right time, or that you don't want to overshare, or that they probably don't actually want to know. But the truth is simpler. You're monitoring, constantly, how you're coming across, whether you're saying too much or not enough, whether they're still interested or starting to lose it. You're reading their tone, their response time, the shift in their energy, and you're adjusting yourself accordingly. Not because you're manipulative, but because somewhere along the way, you learned that being yourself fully was risky, so you offer pieces, edited versions, the parts of you that feel safe to show, and you call it caution, or boundaries, or having standards. But what it really is withholding, not out of cruelty, out of fear. Because there's a part of you that believes if they saw more, they would choose less. So you stay careful, you stay controlled, you stay just out of reach, and the connection, which could have deepened, stays shallow. Then eventually, it fades. They stop reaching out as much, or you do. The energy shifts, the momentum dies, and you tell yourself it just didn't work out. But the truth you don't say out loud is this. You never let it work out. You were interested, you wanted it, but you also made sure it couldn't go anywhere that would require you to be fully seen, because being seen feels more dangerous than being alone. And so, you choose distance, not loudly, not definitively, just enough to make sure no one gets close enough to decide you're not enough. The desire for connection is real, but the instinct to protect yourself is stronger, and the two cannot coexist. So the pattern continues, not because you don't want love, but because wanting it and allowing it are not the same thing. There's a belief that lives beneath all of this. It's not something you think about consciously. It doesn't surface in daily life, but it's there, quietly shaping every choice you make in relationships before they become relationships. It sounds like this. If I am fully known, I will not be chosen. Not as a thought, as a certainty, a conclusion you arrived at long ago, somewhere in your past, and never questioned again. Maybe it formed after a rejection that felt definitive. Maybe it built slowly, across years of feeling misunderstood or dismissed. Maybe it came from a single moment when you revealed something true about yourself and watched someone pull away. However it started, it settled in. And now it runs beneath everything. You don't believe you're unlovable in theory. You can accept that someone might love you under the right conditions, with the right version of you, the one that's easy, the one that doesn't ask for too much, the one that stays composed. But the version of you that's messy, that struggles, that carries fear or doubt or need, that version, you've decided, is too much. And if someone saw that version fully, they would leave. So you don't let them see it. You manage what they know. You control the narrative. You show them enough to seem open, but not so much that they could reject something real. And it works. For a while. They stay interested. They stay engaged. Because the version you're showing them is safe to want, but it's not complete. And at some point you feel it. The gap between who you are and who you're presenting. The exhaustion of maintaining the performance. Just the loneliness of being wanted for a version of yourself you can't sustain. And instead of closing that gap, instead of risking more, you start to pull back. Because the closer someone gets, the harder it becomes to hide what you believe they can't accept. And the fear underneath all of this is not just about being unlovable. It's about being seen and confirmed. About someone looking at you fully, the unedited version, and deciding that what you've always feared about yourself is true. That's the fear that runs everything. Not rejection from a distance, but rejection after exposure. Being known and then being left. That feels unbearable. So you leave first. Not literally, not always, but emotionally, internally. You stop letting it go deeper. You create reasons why it wouldn't work. You convince yourself the timing is wrong, or they're not right, or it's just not meant to be. And the relationship ends. Not because it had to, but because you made sure it would. Before it could get to the part where you'd have to be real. Before it could reach the point where your fear could be proven right. And this becomes the cost. Not that relationships fail, but that they're not allowed to exist in the first place. You protect yourself from rejection by rejecting the possibility of connection before it forms. And you do it so quietly, so automatically, that it doesn't even feel like a choice. It just feels like what happens. Like relationships are something that fade. Like depth is something other people get to have. But the truth is harder than that. The truth is that you've been ending things before they start. Not because you don't want them, but because wanting them and believing you're allowed to have them are two entirely different things. And somewhere along the way, you stopped believing you were allowed. So you stopped trying. And the loneliest part is this. You're not alone because no one wants you. You're alone because you've made it impossible for anyone to choose you fully. Because you never let them see enough to choose. But here's what that heaviness misses. The pattern isn't a flaw. That's the first thing to understand. It's not weakness. It's not self-sabotage in the way people usually mean it. It's not proof that something is fundamentally wrong with you. It's protection. At some point, earlier than you probably remember, you learned that being fully yourself carried risk. That openness could lead to pain. That vulnerability was not safe. And so you adapted. You built distance into your relationships before anyone else could. You learned to monitor, to edit, to control what people saw. Not because you wanted to manipulate them, but because you needed to survive emotionally. And it worked. It kept you from being hurt in the ways you feared most. It kept you from being exposed and then abandoned. It gave you a sense of control in situations that felt threatening. But what protects you at one stage of life can trap you in another. The belief that kept you safe when you were younger, when rejection felt catastrophic, is now the thing preventing the connection you want. Because the fear is no longer responding to present reality. It's responding to past wounds that never fully healed. And so it treats every new person as if they will hurt you the same way. Every new relationship as if it will end the same way. Even when there's no evidence of that. Even when the person in front of you is trying to get closer. The fear doesn't see them. It sees the past, and it reacts accordingly. This is where the real shift begins, not in trying to force yourself to be vulnerable. Not in deciding to just let people in as if it were that simple, but in recognizing what's actually happening. The problem isn't that people leave. The problem is that you leave first, internally, emotionally, before anything real has a chance to form. You decide the ending in advance. You tell yourself the story before it's written. You assume the rejection before it happens. And then you act in ways that make the story come true. Not because you want it to, but because the fear convinces you it's inevitable. And when the relationship fades, when the connection dissolves, it feels like confirmation. See, it wouldn't have worked anyway. But that's not what happened. What happened is that you made sure it couldn't work. You withheld the parts of yourself that would have allowed it to deepen. You kept the distance that made fading the only possible outcome. And you did this so smoothly, so automatically, that it felt like something that just happened to you. But it didn't happen to you. You participated, actively, in ways you didn't fully see. And understanding that doesn't mean blaming yourself. It means recognizing that you have more control than you thought. Not over whether someone will love you. You can't control that. You never could. But over whether you allow yourself to be seen. Over whether you give connection a chance to exist before deciding it won't. The belief that says, if I am fully known, I will not be chosen, is not a fact. It's a prediction. One you've been testing by making sure no one ever gets close enough to prove it wrong. And the tragedy is this. You've been so afraid of being rejected for who you really are that you've rejected yourself first. You've withheld your full self from every relationship and then felt lonely inside of them. You've kept people at a distance and then wondered why no one really knows you. But they couldn't know you because you didn't let them. And that realization, as uncomfortable as it is also where the possibility begins. Because if the pattern is something you've been doing, even unconsciously, then it's also something you can stop doing. Not all at once, not perfectly, but gradually. You can start to notice the moment the fear kicks in, the point where you would normally pull back, the reflex to edit yourself or create distance. And instead of acting on it automatically, you can pause. You can ask yourself a different question. Not, what if they reject me? But what if they don't? What if the thing you've been so afraid of, the exposure you've been avoiding, is actually the only way connection becomes possible? What if being fully known is not the thing that makes you unlovable, but the thing that allows you to be loved at all? You won't know until you try. And trying doesn't mean being reckless. It doesn't mean oversharing or forcing intimacy or pretending the fear isn't there. It just means not letting the fear make every decision for you. It means giving someone the chance to see you and stay. Not because you're certain they will, but because you're no longer certain they won't. And that shift, small as it sounds, changes everything. Because the problem was never your lovability. It was your belief about your lovability. And beliefs can change. Slowly, with evidence, with risk, but they can change. There's a different kind of stillness that comes after this. Not the stillness of avoidance, not the quiet that comes from shutting down or stepping back, but the stillness of understanding something you didn't have words for before. You begin to see it clearly now. The relationships didn't fail because you weren't enough. They faded because you never let them begin. Not really. You were there. You showed up. But only partially. Only the parts you thought were safe to offer. And you called that trying. But it wasn't trying. It was protecting. And protection, however necessary it once was, became the thing that kept you isolated. Not because people didn't want to know you, but because you decided in advance that they wouldn't, and then you made sure they never got close enough to prove you wrong. That's what was happening. And seeing it doesn't fix it immediately. It doesn't erase the fear or make vulnerability suddenly feel easy. But it does something else. It removes the layer of shame that's been sitting on top of everything. Because for years, maybe, You've carried a quiet belief that something about you makes connection impossible, that you're the common denominator in every failed relationship, that the problem is you fundamentally. But that was never true. The problem wasn't you. It was the story you were telling yourself about you, the conclusion you reached years ago and never questioned, the belief that if people really knew you, they would leave. And now you see it for what it is, not a fact, a fear. One that's been running silently in the background, making decisions, shaping outcomes. It's like keeping you at a distance from the very thing you want. And when you see it, something shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the weight of it loosens. Because you're not broken, you're not unlovable, you're not destined to be alone. You've just been carrying a belief that made being alone feel safer than being seen. And that belief, however deeply rooted, is not permanent. It can be questioned. It can be softened. It can be tested against new evidence. You don't have to believe it forever. And maybe that's the real relief. Not that connection is suddenly easy. Not that the fear disappears. But that you're no longer living as if the fear is the truth. You can feel it and still choose differently. You can notice the instinct to pull back and decide not to. Not every time. Not perfectly. But sometimes. And sometimes is enough. Because the question isn't whether you'll ever feel afraid of being known. The question is whether you'll let that fear decide everything for you. And now, you have a choice you didn't realize you had before. You can stop deciding the ending in advance. You can stop writing people off before they've had a chance to stay. You can stop testing whether they'll leave by making sure they never get close enough to choose. You can just let it unfold, without controlling it, without managing every moment, without editing yourself into something you think is easier to love. And that might be the hardest thing. Not because it requires grand gestures or dramatic vulnerability, but because it requires you to stop protecting yourself from something that hasn't happened yet. To be present without an exit plan. Why to let someone see you and trust that what they see won't destroy you? Even if they walk away, even if it doesn't work out, you'll survive that. You've survived it before in the versions where you never let it start. And this time, if it ends, at least it will have been real. At least you will have tried. Not the edited version of trying, not the controlled version, but the actual thing. Being known and allowing someone the chance to choose you anyway. That's what changes. Not the guarantee of a different outcome, but the possibility of one. And possibility, even without certainty, is enough to begin again. Not desperately, not urgently, but with a quiet openness that wasn't there before. A willingness to see what happens when you stop leaving before you arrive. When you stop building distance into every connection as if distance is the only safe place to exist. Maybe it won't work. Maybe the fear will be right sometimes, but maybe it won't. And you'll never know until you stop deciding in advance. So the question that lingers now isn't one you have to answer immediately. It's just one you carry differently than before. What changes if I don't decide the ending in advance? You don't know yet. But for the first time in a long time, you're willing to find out. And that's not nothing. That's the beginning of something else entirely.